Welcome to our deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at Self-Knowledge and Guide to Sex Instruction.
Oh, yeah.
It's this book from 1915 by T.W.Shannon,
Okay.
and it's kind of amazing how
Okay.
much it can tell us about views on, sex education and social purity back then.
It's like a time capsule, right? Like you
Yeah.
open this book and suddenly you're transported back to the early 20th century.
Yeah, and you get to see how people thought about, relationships
Absolutely.
and morality and all these things that we still talk about today, but in a completely different context.
And I think one of the things that really jumps out at you when you start reading is how Shannon really emphasizes family dynamics.
Oh, absolutely.
He lays out these very specific roles for fathers and mothers.
Right, from the get-go, he's talking about the father as the head of the household.
Exactly.
Not just, providing financially, but also being this moral compass for the whole family.
It's like he sets the ethical tone.
Yeah, there's that line that really struck me.
Yeah.
No teacher, minister, or political leader has a more important role than a conscientious father
Yeah.
building an ideal home.
There's a lot of pressure on dads.
No kidding. So where does that leave the mothers then?
Well, that's interesting, too,
Yeah.
because while he does acknowledge the wife as an equal partner,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to their rights within the marriage,
Yeah.
he really dives deep into the mother's role in creating this nurturing and morally upright home environment.
Yeah, it's like he's saying,
Almost like if you keep a nice home, your sons won't be tempted to, go out looking for pleasures in what he calls questionable places.
so it makes you wonder, was that just like a reflection of the times, you know, women's roles being largely confined to the domestic sphere?
It's hard to say for sure, but it was definitely a time when those traditional gender roles were very much in place.
Right.
And maybe there was this sense of anxiety about society changing and what that meant for the traditional family structure.
It's like he's trying to hold on to these traditional values in a world that's rapidly changing around him.
Yeah, maybe.
But here's the thing that I found really interesting.
Okay, what's that?
He's actually pretty progressive when it comes to advocating for a single moral standard for boys and girls.
Oh, yeah. He really criticizes that double standard.
Totally.
That, boys could sow their wild oats, but girls were expected to remain pure.
Right. Like, why should a boy be allowed to swear or drink or engage in, sexual activity if it's considered wrong for a girl to do the same?
That was a pretty radical idea for 1915.
Yeah, absolutely. It challenges the whole system, right?
For sure. And you have to wonder how people reacted to that at the time.
Yeah, I'd love to know more about like the social and intellectual climate back then,
Yeah.
what other thinkers were influencing these ideas.
Right.
But maybe we should move on to another big theme in the book,
Right.
which is sex education.
All right. Yeah. He's a big believer in early and honest conversations about sex.
Huge advocate for that. He says parents should never lie to their children about where babies come from.
And he's all about open communication.
Yeah.
Really emphasizing using simple language that kids can understand.
He even shares a story about how he explained the birth process to his own son.
Oh, yeah.
Using the analogy of kittens being born.
Yeah, so interesting.
I know, right? It's like he's trying to take this really complex subject and make it relatable for a child.
And it really speaks to his whole approach to sex education.
Totally, like clarity and honesty over shame and secrecy.
Which is still so relevant today.
Oh, absolutely. Open communication is key.
But of course, he was writing over a century ago, so some of his views are, well,
A product of their time.
Yeah.
Like, while he's all for honest sex education, he also condemns premarital sex.
Right.
Masturbation, prostitution for both men and women.
He doesn't hold back.
No, he really paints a picture of like the consequences of what he calls impurity.
He does.
Like he uses this example of a boy who tries to be a man by smoking and ends up experiencing all these negative physical effects.
Oh, wow.
And it's almost like he's saying, engaging in these vices will lead to your downfall.
It really highlights the moral anxieties surrounding sexuality at the time.
Yeah, they were worried about all sorts of things.
It makes you think about how those anxieties shaped people's relationships and how they approached sex and intimacy.
Oh, for sure. And it makes you appreciate how far we've come in some ways,
Yeah,
but also how much we still might be influenced by those same anxieties.
definitely.
So we've talked about fathers, mothers, the single moral standard.
Right.
But Shannon also has a lot to say about protecting girls.
Oh, yeah. He really stresses the responsibility of boys to protect a girl's virtue.
And he criticizes that double standard again,
Totally.
where men's indiscretions are excused, but women are condemned for the same actions.
He even calls on boys to be like true knights, upholding this single moral standard.
It's like he's trying to instill this sense of chivalry and respect for women
Yeah, it's an interesting attempt to sort of elevate the status of women.
within the confines of a patriarchal system.
Exactly.
So it's this weird mix of progressive and traditional ideas.
Yeah, it's complex for sure.
It shows how messy social change can be.
Oh,
It's
absolutely.
not always a clear path forward.
So what are your thoughts so far? We've covered a lot in this first part. Family morality, sex education.
It's been a whirlwind.
I know, right?
It's amazing to see how Shannon brings all these topics together.
It's all interconnected, isn't it?
Yeah, and it gives us this glimpse into the anxieties and beliefs of the early 20th century
Totally.
and how those beliefs shaped the way people thought about sex and relationships.
Yeah, it makes you realize that even these seemingly outdated ideas can still teach us something about human behavior.
And about how society changes over time.
Absolutely.
And believe it or not, we're just getting started.
Oh, there's more.
In the next part of our deep dive, we're going to explore some of Shannon's more controversial views.
Like what?
Things like marriage heredity,
Oh, wow.
even eugenics.
Okay, now that's going to be interesting.
Yeah, so buckle up. It's going to be a wild ride.
Can't wait.
All right. So we're back, and we're still deep in T.W.Shannon's world.
Still in 1915.
1915, that's right. Self-knowledge and guide to sex instruction. And in this part, we're getting into some really fascinating territory.
It's pretty wild, yeah.
Yeah, we talked about family morality.
Right.
But now Shannon takes us into the realm of heredity.
Heredity and its supposed impact on, a child's physical development, mental development, even their morals.
Yeah, and he uses some pretty interesting examples to illustrate his points.
Oh, he does. He's got stories.
He does.
It's like about birthmarks and deformities and how they might be connected to what the mother experienced during pregnancy.
Like those old wives' tales, right?
Totally. Like, if a pregnant woman craves strawberries, her baby will have a strawberry birthmark.
Exactly. But Shannon takes it a step further.
He does. He goes all in.
He has this one anecdote
Oh, yeah, I remember this one.
about a pregnant woman who was startled by a crawfish.
And her child was born with a double thumb.
A double thumb.
It's like something out of a scary story.
I know, right? But we have to remember that this was a time when people really believed that a mother's experiences could directly shape her child.
Absolutely. Imagine the pressure on pregnant women back then.
Oh my gosh, the anxiety must have been through the roof.
Right. Like every little thing you did, every emotion you felt could somehow affect your unborn child.
It's wild to think about.
It really shows how scientific ideas, even when they're based on limited understanding, can have a huge impact on society.
And on individual behavior, too.
For sure. And speaking of scientific ideas that, maybe haven't aged so well,
Right.
Shannon also touches upon eugenics.
Oh, yeah, eugenics. That's a whole other can of worms.
It was a big movement back then, the idea of improving the human race through selective breeding.
And Shannon definitely buys into it.
He suggests that people with what he considered undesirable traits shouldn't be allowed to reproduce.
Undesirable traits, so we're talking like...
Feeble-mindedness, he calls it.
Right.
Criminal tendencies, things like that.
And even people with family histories of alcoholism or hereditary diseases.
It's a chilling thought when you consider how those ideas were used to justify some really awful things.
Absolutely. It's a reminder of how science can be twisted and used to support prejudice and discrimination.
It's a dark side of history that we can't forget.
So what does Shannon propose as a solution to all of this?
Oh, he's all about stricter marriage laws.
Okay, stricter in what way?
Like mandatory education on heredity and prenatal care for anyone who wants to get married.
Wow.
He even suggests that couples should register their intention to marry 3 months in advance so they can undergo all these evaluations.
The evaluations, like what kind of evaluation?
Health evaluations, character evaluations, you name it.
So basically deciding who's fit to marry and have children.
That's pretty intense, right?
It's like something out of a dystopian novel.
I know it's crazy to think about, but that was the mindset back then.
Social engineering is a way to fix society's problems.
And it wasn't just about marriage regulations either. Shannon also criticizes a lot of societal customs that he thinks contribute to immorality and the decline of the family.
Okay, like what?
Well, for one thing, he's not happy about the low wages paid to women.
Why is that?
He argues that it makes them more vulnerable to exploitation, forces them into prostitution.
He's connecting economic hardship to moral decline.
Exactly. He sees that link.
It's interesting. He's not just focusing on individual behavior.
He's looking at the bigger picture, the social and economic factors that contribute to these problems.
But his solutions might seem a bit simplistic to us now.
Maybe, but at least he's recognizing that these issues exist.
That's true. And to his credit, he also criticizes that double standard that we keep talking about.
The one that holds women to a higher moral standard than men.
Exactly.
He sees how that perpetuates inequality and contributes to the exploitation of women.
And he's pretty outspoken about it.
Yeah, it's like you said before, he's got this mix of progressive and traditional views.
A man of contradictions.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, and he also condemns the white slave traffic.
Oh, yeah, that was a big issue back then. Organized criminal networks that were trafficking women and girls.
A horrifying thought. And sadly, it's still a problem today.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that some things haven't changed as much as we'd like to think.
So Shannon's calling for stricter laws and more enforcement to combat this.
He wants to protect women and girls.
He sees this as a major social injustice.
And you know what's interesting is how he connects all these different issues together.
Yeah, from like the personal stuff about family life to these bigger social problems.
It's like he's trying to make sense of a world that's rapidly changing around him.
A world that's full of anxieties and uncertainties.
And he's trying to find solutions, even if those solutions might seem flawed or outdated to us now.
So where do we go from here? What's next on our journey through Shannon's guide to sex and relationships?
Well, believe it or not, he doesn't stop at social critiques and theories of heredity.
He's got more to say.
Oh, yeah, he's got a whole section on marriage and parenthood with very specific advice on how to approach these major life stages.
So he's not just diagnosing the problems.
He's offering solutions, his vision for the ideal family.
Sounds intriguing. I'm curious to see what kind of wisdom he has to offer on that front.
Well, let's dive into the final chapter and find out.
Welcome back to the deep dive. And, we've been talking a lot about T.W.Shannon's ideas on family morality, all sorts of things.
It's been quite a journey through his 1915 book.
It has self-knowledge and guide to sex instruction, right?
It's the what?
And in this final part, we're going to tackle the last chapter,
Okay.
which focuses on marriage and parenthood.
And it's interesting how Shannon sort of shifts gears here.
Yeah.
From, social critiques and theories about heredity
Right.
to offering very practical advice on how to approach these major life stages.
He really tries to lay out a blueprint for the ideal marriage and family.
Yeah, he's got all these specific recommendations.
Like what kind of recommendation?
Well, for instance, he stresses the importance of preparing for parenthood,
Okay.
both physically and mentally.
So what does that mean practically?
Well, he urges couples to adopt a healthy lifestyle,
Okay.
even before conception,
So like eating right, exercising, that sort of thing?
Exactly. He even advises abstaining from alcohol, tobacco, strong coffee.
Wow, that's pretty strict.
It is, but it shows how much emphasis he puts on creating the right conditions for a healthy child.
It's like he's saying you need to be in tip-top shape to even think about having kids.
Yeah, he really believes that parents have a responsibility to give their children the best possible start in life.
And it's not just about physical health either, right?
He also talks about the importance of cultivating positive emotions
Okay.
because he believes that those emotions can somehow influence the developing child.
Interesting. So it's like a mind-body connection thing.
Yeah, and it shows that even back then, people were starting to think about the ways in which a mother's mental state could affect her pregnancy.
It's pretty forward-thinking when you consider the limited scientific knowledge they had at the time.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, something else that really stood out to me in this chapter
Okay.
is how Shannon delves into the more intimate aspects of marriage.
Oh, yeah, he doesn't shy away from those topics.
He actually talks about a woman's menstrual cycle and its influence on marital relations.
And this is 1915, right?
That's what makes it so surprising.
It's pretty groundbreaking for its time.
It is. He emphasizes the natural fluctuations in a woman's sexual desire throughout her cycle.
And he encourages husbands to be sensitive to those changes.
Yeah, he even cautions against, pressuring their wives for intimacy during times of low libido.
It's like he's recognizing a woman's agency and bodily autonomy within the marriage.
Which is a pretty radical idea for that era.
Yeah, it challenges the traditional view of women as, subservient to their husband's desires.
But Shannon also acknowledges the potential downsides of marriage.
What do you mean?
Well, he talks about how women can become burdened by excessive childbearing.
He actually uses the phrase enslaved motherhood.
That's a pretty powerful image.
It is. It really highlights the physical and emotional toll of constant pregnancies and childcare.
He even suggests that it can lead to exhaustion, illness, premature aging,
He's basically saying that society's expectations of women are too high.
and that they're sacrificing their well-being in the process.
And what's even more remarkable is that he actually encourages women to take control of their fertility.
What do you mean?
He suggests spacing out pregnancies, prioritizing their own health.
He even says couples should consider limiting the number of children they have.
was a pretty radical idea for 1915.
Most people were still having like 10 kids back then.
Yeah, it was all about quantity over quality.
But Shannon's saying, hey, maybe we need to rethink that maybe a mother's health and happiness are important too.
Yeah, he's advocating for a more balanced approach to family planning.
And it's interesting how he balances those progressive ideas with more traditional views on marriage and family.
Yeah, he's a complicated figure for sure.
Full of contradictions.
But that's what makes him so fascinating to study.
Oh, and before we wrap up, I wanted to mention one more thing.
Okay.
Shannon also talks about change of life.
Menopause.
Yeah, menopause in both men and women.
Interesting. I don't think a lot of people were talking about that back then.
He acknowledges that it can be a challenging transition.
Oh, yeah, physically and emotionally.
Exactly. And he encourages people to approach it with self-care and understanding.
Like he's saying, hey, this is a natural part of life.
And he even suggests that couples should use this time to nurture their intimacy and affection for each other.
It's a nice sentiment, right?
It is. It shows that he recognizes the importance of lifelong companionship.
And that relationships evolve over time.
So as we come to the end of our deep dive into T.W.Shannon's world, what are your final takeaways?
Well, this book has been a real eye-opener.
It has.
It's given us a glimpse into a time when people were grappling with so many changes. Evolving gender roles, anxieties about morality, and these new scientific discoveries that were reshaping the way they understood sex and relationships.
It's been fascinating to see how Shannon tries to make sense of it all,
He's got this mix of progressive and traditional ideas.
which I think reflect the complexity of the era.
Yeah, it's not a simple black and white picture.
It's messy and nuanced, just like life itself.
And it makes you wonder how much our own views on sex and relationships have really changed since then.
That's a great question to ponder, and maybe that's a good place to leave it for our listeners.
Yeah, let them think about it.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into T.W. Shannon's Self-Knowledge and Guide to Sex Instruction.
It's been a pleasure.
It has. And who knows, maybe we'll unearth another fascinating historical text for our next deep dive.
Always up for an adventure.
So stay tuned.